This was the life of an oil worker in the USA. On October 19th, 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo against the United States. Within weeks, the price of crude oil had begun a climb that would nearly quadruple it, from $2.90 per barrel before the embargo to $11.65 per barrel by January of 1974. Americans lined up for hours at gas stations. Speed limits were lowered to 55 miles per hour nationwide to conserve fuel. The president went on television to ask people to turn down their thermostats. And in the oil fields of Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Wyoming, a very different kind of response was taking shape. One that would transform the lives of the men who worked the drilling rigs. The message from Washington was clear. The United States needed to produce more of its own oil as fast as possible. What that meant on the ground was a hiring surge of historic proportions. Between 1973 and 1980, employment in the oil and natural gas extraction industries would grow by more than 400,000 workers, a 91% increase in less than a decade. Drilling rigs that had been idle or working at reduced capacity began operating around the clock. New wells were being spudded across the Permian Basin of West Texas, the Anadarko Basin of Oklahoma, and the Gulf Coast of Louisiana at a pace that strained the supply of experienced crews. Young men with strong backs and no particular qualifications, beyond a willingness to work 12-hour shifts in extreme conditions, found themselves driving out to rig sites and getting hired the same day. What they were walking into was one of the most physically dangerous workplaces in the American economy. A fact that 1973's hiring boom did nothing to change and several things to make worse. A rotary drilling rig in 1973 was a machine of considerable complexity and considerable danger, organized around a single fundamental purpose: driving a drill bit through thousands of feet of rock to reach the oil or gas reservoir below. The rig floor, the central working platform where most of the drilling crew spent their shift, sat several feet above the ground and surrounded the rotary table, the device that transferred torque from the engines to the drill string. The drill string was a column of steel pipe, each joint 30 feet long, that extended from the surface down through the well bore to the bit at the bottom. As drilling progressed, new joints of pipe had to be added to the string from above, a process called making a connection. When the crew needed to change the bit or perform work on the lower portion of the string, they had to pull the entire drill string back out of the well in stands of pipe and stack it in the derrick, a process called tripping out, then run it back in after the work was done. Tripping pipe was the single most dangerous routine operation on any drilling rig. The stands of pipe weighed tons and moved fast. The equipment involved, tongs, slips, elevators, the traveling block, operated under enormous tension and at speeds that left no room for hesitation or miscalculation. 3 out of every 5 serious injuries on a drilling rig happened during pipe handling operations. A man who got his hand between a tong and a joint of pipe did not get a warning. He got an injury that the crew would remember for the rest of their careers. Before we continue, comment below if you have ever worked in a dangerous job. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming content. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. The roughneck was the entry-level position on a drilling crew in 1973. The man at the bottom of the rig hierarchy who did the most physically demanding work and absorbed the most risk for the least pay and the least experience to draw. A roughneck worked the rig floor, handling the tongs used to make up and break out joints of pipe, operating the catwalk that brought pipe from the rack to the floor, cleaning and maintaining equipment, and doing whatever else the driller directed. The work required lifting, pulling, and bracing against forces generated by equipment that weighed thousands of pounds for 12 consecutive hours, in whatever weather the Texas Panhandle or the Oklahoma Plains happened to be producing that day. In summer, the rig floor in West Texas at midday was well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with heat radiating from the metal surfaces in every direction and no shade available. In winter, a rig in the Oklahoma Panhandle or the Wyoming Overthrust Belt could be working in temperatures below zero with wind chills that pushed the effective temperature far lower. The roughneck wore whatever protective gear was standard on that particular rig: hard hat, steel-toed boots, gloves, sometimes a face shield for specific operations, and worked in conditions where the gear was adequate for the hazards it was designed for and entirely inadequate for the hazards it was not. Falls on the rig floor were common. Being struck by pipe, by the spinning chain used to make up connections, or by the traveling block if it came down unexpectedly, accounted for the majority of serious injuries. The spinning chain, a length of heavy chain wrapped around the drill pipe to spin it into the box, was particularly notorious. A roughneck learning to throw chain was learning a skill that could take a finger or a hand in the same motion that was performed correctly 1,000 times before. The derrickman occupied a position at the top of the drilling crew's physical hierarchy that was as literal as it was figurative. His workstation was the monkey board, a small platform mounted in the derricks 60 to 90 feet above the rig floor, where he racked the stands of pipe as they were pulled from the well during tripping operations. Each stand, consisting of 2 or 3 joints connected together, weighed several thousand pounds and arrived at the derrick board moving fast on the end of the traveling block. The derrickman had to grab the stand, swing it to the side, and set it in the rack. A physical act performed repeatedly, for hours 90 feet in the air, on a platform just wide enough to stand on, without a safety harness in most operations in 1973. Falls from the derrick were relatively rare, but when they happened, they were fatal. The derrickman also managed the mud pits, the large tanks of drilling fluid that circulated through the drill string and up the annulus between the pipe and the borehole wall, carrying cuttings to the surface and maintaining the hydrostatic pressure that kept the formation from pushing fluid back up the well. Managing the mud properly was one of the primary defenses against a blowout, and the derrickman was the crew member most directly responsible for monitoring the mud returns and recognizing the early warning signs that the well might be trying to kick. A blowout was the catastrophic failure that every man on every drilling rig in 1973 understood as the ultimate worst case. It happened when the pressure in the formation being drilled exceeded the pressure of the drilling fluid column, allowing oil, gas, or salt water to flow uncontrolled into the wellbore and up to the surface. The warning signs: a sudden increase in the flow of mud returning to the surface, a decrease in the amount of mud being pumped in, the mud pit level rising when it should be staying steady, gave the crew a window of time to respond by closing the blowout preventer, a large valve assembly bolted to the top of the wellhead that could shut in the well and contain the pressure. If the crew recognized the kick and acted quickly enough, a blowout could be prevented. If they didn't, or if the blowout preventer failed, the result was an uncontrolled flow of hydrocarbons at the surface that could ignite from a single spark and burn for days or weeks before a well-controlled specialist could stop it. The gas that came up with a blowout was heavier than air and spread across the rig floor in invisible, explosive concentrations. A single static discharge from the equipment, a running engine, a cigarette, anything that produced a spark in those seconds before the gas dispersed, was enough to turn a blowout into a fireball. Men on rig floors in 1973 had seen it happen, or knew someone who had, and the knowledge shaped how they moved and thought during the specific moments when the mud returns stopped looking right. The tool pusher was the highest-ranking position at the rig site itself, responsible for all of the drilling crews across all 3 shifts, for the mechanical condition of the rig, for the relationship with the company man who represented the oil company's interest on location, and for the 1,000 logistical details that kept a drilling operation moving. A good tool pusher was almost always a man who had started as a roughneck and worked his way up through every position on the rig over a career that might span 20 years. He knew every piece of equipment from having operated it himself, every hazard from having faced it personally, and every shortcut that the pressure of production could tempt a crew into taking, because he had been tempted by them himself. In 1973, with the post-embargo drilling boom, creating pressure to drill faster and with less experienced crews than the industry had ever worked with before, the tool pusher's judgment was frequently the only thing standing between a productive well and a serious accident. He worked 7 days on and 7 days off in most operations, sleeping in a trailer or a doghouse at the rig site during his week on location, available at any hour when something went wrong. What went wrong in the oil field was not predictable in its timing. Wells did not kick during business hours. Equipment did not fail at convenient moments. The tool pusher learned to sleep lightly and to come fully awake fast. The oil patch culture of 1973 was a distinct American subculture that had developed across the oil fields of Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana over half a century of boom and bust cycles, carrying its own language, its own social hierarchies, its own codes of conduct, and its own particular relationship with danger. The term roughneck, originally a descriptor for the physically tough manual laborer of the rig floor, had by 1973 become a word of pride, a self-identification that carried with it a specific set of values: toughness, reliability, the ability to work hard in bad conditions without complaining, and a willingness to back up your crewmates when the situation demanded it. Men who worked the rigs moved from one location to the next as drilling contracts were completed and new ones began, following the work across hundreds of miles of the American interior. The nomadic quality of the life meant that family relationships were under constant strain. A roughneck working a 7-7 rotation was physically absent from home for half his working life, and even during his week off, he was often far enough from the rig location that getting home required most of a day of driving. The towns that grew up around active drilling areas, Midland, Odessa, and Hobbs in Texas and New Mexico, Enid and Elk City in Oklahoma, Morgan City in Louisiana, had the particular character of boom towns, transient populations, cash moving fast, working men with money to spend, and a week off to spend it in. The Arab oil embargo of October 1973 did not simply change the economics of the American oil industry. It fundamentally reframed the political and cultural meaning of domestic oil production. Before the embargo, the oil worker was an unremarkable figure in the American economy, a working man doing a dangerous job in a remote location, no more or less significant in the national imagination than a coal miner or a construction worker. After the embargo, domestic oil production became a matter of national security, and the men doing the drilling became, at least in the political rhetoric of the moment, essential soldiers in a kind of economic war. President Nixon announced Project Independence, an ambitious plan to achieve American energy self-sufficiency by 1980. Congress relaxed regulations on domestic drilling. The price incentives created by the embargo made previously marginal wells economically viable and pushed the industry into formations and locations it had not previously found worth developing. For the roughneck in the field, the practical effect of all this national attention was straightforward. There was more work than there were experienced men to do it, the pay was getting better, and the pressure to drill fast was increasing in direct proportion to the price of oil. None of that made the rig floor any safer. In some respects, it made it more dangerous. The long-term consequences of the 1973 oil shock for the American drilling industry played out across the following decade in ways that the roughnecks working the rigs in that year could not have fully anticipated. The boom that the embargo triggered drove employment and production higher through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, creating a period of extraordinary prosperity in the oil field states, particularly Texas, where the phrase the oil patch became synonymous with wealth, growth, and a particular swagger that the rest of the country found both admirable and slightly ridiculous. The number of active rotary rigs in the United States climbed from roughly 1,500 in 1973 to a peak of over 4,500 in 1981. Then, in 1986, world oil prices collapsed. Within months, hundreds of rigs were stacked, taken out of service and parked in yards, and the employment that had grown by 400,000 workers over the previous decade contracted nearly as fast as it had expanded. The roughnecks, who had followed the boom into the oil patch, found themselves out of work in towns whose entire economies had been built on the assumption that the price of oil would stay high. Some of them went back to whatever they had been doing before. Some of them waited for the next boom. Some of them stayed in the oil field for the rest of their working lives, moving through the cycles of expansion and contraction that have defined the American drilling industry since the first well was completed at Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. The work was hard, the money was real when it came, and the danger was constant regardless of what the price of a barrel of West Texas Intermediate happened to be doing on any given morning. The physical toll of oil field work in 1973 accumulated in ways that were partly visible and partly not. The visible part was the injuries, the crushed fingers, the broken bones, the burns from high-pressure steam lines and hot pipe, the lacerations from chain and cable, and the sharp edges of steel that covered every surface of a working rig. These injuries were common enough that most experienced roughnecks carried the physical record of their careers on their hands, a specific geography of scars and missing fingertips that told the story of close calls and moments when the work moved faster than the body could account for. The less visible part was what happened over time to men who spent years lifting hundreds of pounds per shift, working in sustained noise levels that eroded hearing across a career and absorbing the vibration of heavy machinery through their hands and spines day after day. A roughneck who started on a rig at 22 in 1973 and worked the oil field for the next 30 years was, by the time he retired, carrying damage in his lower back, his knees, and his hands that no single accident report would ever capture, because it had happened in the accumulation of 10,000 ordinary shifts, rather than in any one catastrophic moment. This was the arithmetic of physical labor in the American oil field, understood by everyone who did the work and documented by almost no one at the time it was happening. The 1973 oil embargo forced the United States to confront a dependency it had spent decades building without acknowledging. The country that consumed 1/3 of the world's oil production, while holding only 6% of its population, had assumed, for most of the post-war period, that the oil would always be there when it was needed, and that the price would always be manageable. The men on the drilling rigs of Texas and Oklahoma had known something different, had known it in the specific physical reality of every well they drilled, every formation they pushed through, every declining field they watched, produced less with each passing year. Domestic production had peaked in 1970 and was already falling when the Arab states cut off the supply. The roughnecks, who responded to the post-embargo drilling boom by going to work on the new rigs being assembled across the Permian Basin, and the Anadarko, were not solving the problem the politicians were describing. They were buying time. The oil was finite. The formations were harder to reach with each new well. The easy fields were already producing at decline. What 1973's surge in drilling activity accomplished was significant but bounded. More domestic production, yes, but not enough to replace what the embargo had removed, and not for long enough to matter without a fundamental rethinking of how the country consumed the energy its workers were risking their lives to extract. That rethinking would take decades, and it is still not finished.